Mental health in the workforce has again risen to the forefront of employers' minds. This month, the ATO was the subject of some scathing criticisms by the Fair Work Commission over its treatment of an employee who'd been suffering from a mental health condition. Commissioner Rawdins described the ATO's actions as unconscionable, remarking that he hoped an employee diagnosed with depression and anxiety in the future is not treated in, quote-unquote, the same shabby manner. This is the employee regarding the case here with the ATO. What really was the trap, though, that the ATO fell into as an employer, and what can others do to make sure they avoid doing the same? Well, Joydeep Hor, People and Culture Strategies, is with me to talk us through it, and thank you very much, Joydeep. We appreciate it. The specialist employment law firm People and Culture Strategies, of course. Walk us through the background of this case, of this particular employee of the ATO.
Sure. So this was an unfair dismissal case. So the dismissed employee argued that the way in which he had been treated by the ATO, his employer gave him no choice but to resign. What the case really involved, though, was a scrutiny of how well or how poorly the ATO had responded to this particular employee when he had medical certification that he had been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and various other mental health impacts, all of which was argued to have been triggered by bullying and harassment that he had sustained while at work. Now, the ATO did what many employers had to do and try to rehabilitate and reintegrate him back into the workforce, but it was the way in which they went about it that really compromised them, because, and it's important to note that they won the case in terms of they were able to say that the dismissal was not unfair, but in some ways that's almost irrelevant, because in that intense scrutiny of how they went about dealing with this employee, it was found that they were quite sinister and almost did all the things that an employer shouldn't do when it comes to how to deal with an employee that presents with a mental health condition.
Yeah, they kind of won the battle, but not the war in some ways. In terms of why the Commissioner was so scathing, what are some of those points, you know, along the way that was just so wrong from the ATO?
So if we take the sequence of events, he claims that he's been bullied and harassed. He's then off work for a few months. His doctor says if he goes back to work and has to work with the same people, then it's highly unlikely that this employment relationship is going to continue. It's going to end badly, is essentially what the doctor says. Now, the ATO, rather than responding to that in the way that they should, i.e. have him work for different people, transfer him to a different area, and they're certainly big enough to do that, they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to make you continue to work with the same people who you were working with before, effectively paying very scant regard to what the doctor was saying. Then, in spite of the fact that there were no issues with this employee's performance, there were no claims that he had continued to be bullied and harassed, the ATO, off their own volition, say, we want you to go back to your doctor and attend a series of appointments so that we get some kind of satisfaction that there's nothing wrong with you. Now, in the course of that, the doctor says, well, all of this seems a bit heavy-handed. There's nothing wrong with this particular person. Things are okay. Why are you in this guy's face, essentially? And so it then gets to a point where the employee feels, well, there's this agenda here to exit me. Now, when it comes to constructive dismissal, which is this notion that a person resigns, but they argue that they had no choice but to resign, it's always a very hard thing to get up on a constructive dismissal case, because an employer really must be saying to the employee, you have to resign or else. That's not what was happening here, and ultimately why the ATO won the case. But what the key learnings are for employers is that if you have an employee who is presenting medical information, that medical information is giving you recommendations, guidance, call it what you will, there is an expectation that you will work constructively with the medical professionals to try to rehabilitate that particular person into the workplace. The facts in this particular case suggest that what clearly happened was that this person was identified as a troublemaker, the ATO paid lip service to its obligations, and they were just waiting, and almost quite Machiavellian in their way of just under the auspices of saying, oh, well, we're just looking after your health and safety, we're going to force you to continue to see your doctor.
It's almost like they had those policies in place and they could say, we're ticking the boxes, but culturally it just wasn't right, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Something like,
exactly. And so
that's one major takeaway for employers.
It is a major takeaway for employers, and I think this is a very difficult issue for employers to manage. But I think that employers make a lot of assumptions as to writing someone off, essentially, when they're away from the workplace for a while. And certainly when it happens in the context of, say, bullying and harassment claims, automatically the person tends to be earmarked as a troublemaker.
Yeah.
And they are going to come unstuck. Even if you win unfair dismissal cases, you don't want your employer brand and you don't want your morale and your reputation as an employer, particularly when you're such a high-profile employer like the ATO, because the other criticism was that the suggestion that they were using their gravitas as the Australian Taxation Office in dealing with the medical practitioner was something that was pretty frowned upon as well.
Yeah, and to see the Fair Work Commission's court talk about unconscionable conduct and shabby treatment, it was pretty strong wording. Joydeep, there's certainly some big takeaways for businesses there. Thank you very much for bringing that case to us. Appreciate that. From People and Culture Strategies Managing Principal, Joydeep Hor, that's it for Business Agenda. We have the final